So you are what, 13, 14 years now removed from a spinal fusion?
Yeah. So I had it done when I was 19 years old, and I would say it was a really successful surgery for me. I don't think I could be doing the things that I do now if I'd decided not to have that operation.
And that's from scoliosis?
Yeah, so I had an S curve, so about 50 and 52 degrees, I think the two curvatures were, and I also had a rotation in the thoracic. And so before surgery, I had a lot of discomfort. I was in chronic pain. I had a lot of muscle spasming, and I was also my rib cage was twisted, so I wasn't able to use my full lung capacity anymore. It was to the point where sort of organs and things are starting to not have the space that they needed. And it was a decision made sort of with my future in mind that if I ever was going to fall pregnant, that there would be space for baby, and also obviously to try and get me out of the chronic pain that I was living in. And like I said, it was really successful for me.
Good. So how long were you living in pain?
I got diagnosed with scoliosis when I was 14. And we originally tried to brace me through my teens to try and avoid needing the surgery. So I wore a brace for 20 hours a day for 4 years. And that unfortunately wasn't successful. So that was hard. Obviously, like being a teenager wearing a full torso spinal brace, other than the fact that that was very uncomfortable and sore, it also was a little bit isolating as a teenager. I couldn't just sort of run around on the field at lunchtime the same as everybody else. When it was PE class, I got to take it off, or when I was dancing, because I was a dancer at the time, I got to take it off for those things. But I'd have to get it back on, and I actually needed somebody to help me put it back on to make sure it was tight enough. So there'd be like two or three girls in the change room with me trying to like get this brace back on tight enough. And like people used to walk past and like instead of just saying hey, like they'd kind of knock on my brace and they'd tap on it, and because it was obviously this hard thing, and I was stuck with this obscenely perfect posture in class where everybody else is slouching over their desk and I'm sitting there straight up like a rod because I had this brace on. And it was really uncomfortable, and it was not a good time, and unfortunately it didn't work in the way that we wanted it to, and my scoliosis did still progress to the point where I needed the surgery.
Okay. So you get to 19 and you decide now it's time for the fusion.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'd stopped bracing at around 18, and it got like rapidly worse after the bracing, and I was in so much pain. And we were talking to obviously my surgeon who I'd been seeing throughout the years on my journey with bracing, and he'd sort of said, you know, this doesn't need to be done now. You could do this later in your 20s or 30s once it gets to a point that you do like really need it. But obviously at 19, I still lived at home with my mum. I could take time off, work to recover. I could have like be living in an environment where I can be supported through that recovery. Whereas if I waited until I was in my mid 20s or 30s, other than the fact that it would have been an even bigger operation because it would have been worse, I also wouldn't necessarily have had the lifestyle to make that recovery that little bit easier by living at home with my mum. So, yeah, we just decided it was the way to go, and yeah, it was the right decision.
Hmm. I bet it didn't seem like the right decision right after surgery, did it?
Oh, there was definite wonder about what I would be able to do again. I was a dancer at the time, and I was also doing karate, and getting back into those was very slow. Obviously, it starts right back from in the hospital where I, kind of had to learn to walk again, and then to the point where when I did start going back to dance classes or karate classes, I just stood back in the back row and did very little versions of the movements to try and recalibrate where my center of mass was, and that sort of proprioceptive awareness that if I stuck both my arms out to the side, I had like one way up higher than the other, because what used to feel straight didn't feel straight anymore. And so I had to kind of relearn where my body was in space as part of that recovery. And I think it was about 3 months before I was allowed to sort of jump or do anything sort of with any sort of sharp movements. But in saying that, while it felt really slow at the time and I felt very limited and I was still in a fair amount of pain while I was initially recovering, by the time I was a year post surgery, I was back on stage again with dancing. I think at the time of the operation, I'd set a goal to try and do one dance at the end of year concert. I ended up doing 13. And I was back in the tournament circuit with karate, I think just before a year out from my surgery as well. And while once I got to a year, I'm like, wow, that recovery was actually quite fast. But along the way, it felt so slow and I felt so limited. And I was used to being good at things and I felt like I had to just do regression versions of everything. But it absolutely, like, by the time you get to a year, that time actually flies by and I was out of pain and I was able to do most things at that point. And I would definitely say now at this point, it barely limits me at all.
Yeah, so that's kind of the same for me. And after a year, I could do most of the things I could do prior to the surgery. But then, I mean, when I got to 2 years and now at 3 years, things felt so much better. And I remember doing a video at 1 year and I'm like, guys, I'm like 85, 90%. And then I get to 2 years and I'm like, no, I wasn't. I was at like 65, 70. Now I'm at 85, 90. But
Yeah.
it's truly amazing that in a year you were back already dancing. Now, does that dancing require you to jump around in like dynamic movements?
Yeah, so I had to be able to jump, and that's fine, like do leaps across the stage and things like that, and I could do those things. Where some of the dances had to be modified a little bit was just anything that really required spinal flexion or contraction because I am fused at the end of the day. So I can't arch my back or round my back forward. And so there was a couple of movements where something had been put into the choreography that I just couldn't do because I couldn't make that shape with my torso. And so they would either create an A and B group where half the people on stage do one thing and half do the other, or they just slightly change it. So there was a couple of little modifications, but that's literally just down to me being able to arch my back or round it depending on the movement. Or if we're flat on the floor on your back kind of thing and you have to sort of roll up, I can't do that. It's like I can't do crunch type movements, but that's not because of pain. That's just because I've got rods in my spine. So yeah, small adjustments, but overall, like no one watching the performance would have been able to tell that anything was different.